I want to start by looking at our agenda for today. I want to discuss the purpose of this session, what it is, and more importantly, I want to discuss what it is not. Because I have a very narrow lane, and I'm going to stay in my lane. I want to examine a framework that could be helpful to you. It is just one suggestion. There are lots of frameworks out there. I want to explore some examples. I want to define some key terms that might be a little fuzzy for you. And then my hope is that you leave with at least one goal. Leave here today with one goal, and then you can replicate that and write more and or help other people in your faculty do that. So the purpose of this session is for me to help you learn how to write instructional goals or teaching goals. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about service and scholarship, but we're looking at faculty goals overall. I have no idea and very little input about the process, about how this is going to work, about how the chairs are going to evaluate. I can't answer those questions. So to start, what I would like for you to do on a piece of paper or on your handout is I would like for you to write one teaching goal in the same way that you've written them in the past, or you can go in faculty success or activity insights and look at and pull out one of your old goals, okay? I don't want you to do anything new. I don't want you to try to think into this new framework yet. I want you to just write a goal as you've always written a goal. I do think if it could be teaching, that would be very helpful for our purposes today. So write a teaching goal that you've either been thinking about or pull one that you have done in faculty success or activity insights and pull one out and look at it. We're going to take 2 or 3 minutes for you to do that, and then we will move on. If you write a good goal, it helps you focus, and it also helps you get down to the end of the year and realize that you did accomplish some things, that you did get some things done, and you got some things done in the service of your teaching and your service and your scholarship. But if we don't prioritize it, you and I all know our to-do list is too long. It falls way down to the bottom. And one of the hardest things for me as chair is realizing that teaching sometimes does fall to the bottom of the list. That's really challenging for me because that's how I identify I'm a teacher. I don't want to be the teacher who just shows up and does great classes because this is my gift, but I need to be a little more intentional than that. So the overwhelming purpose of these goals is not to gotcha, it's not to get you, it's not, I didn't hear any language like that. The overwhelming purpose is for you to be able to communicate well to your chair, and then hopefully your chair to be able to provide supports to you and work with you so that you can accomplish your goals. So that's priority one. I would say the second thing is really thinking about the fact that we're all doing really amazing work, and we want to be able to accurately represent that and tell our story. This also helps everybody at the university level, from senior leadership on down, tell the story of what we're doing at our university that makes us ACU, because that's really what we're selling and leveraging here. So, okay, if you're looking at this goal, I want you to, I think you're with people around you. You've got, looks like table partners. This is also not the format I had in mind either. Again, I thought there'd be 12 of us gathered around a table. But I want you to turn to someone next to you and share your goal, and then perhaps discuss like what made you could talk about why this is a goal. One of my goals that I've been thinking about is I teach an introductory course to children's literature. It's one of the first they take, and they don't know things like genre and the 5 elements all narrative stories have, but I've really been struggling with, am I teaching things so simply that they're not prepared for the rigor that's coming in our future education courses? So I've been trying to think about how to increase. So what led to the goal? You could talk about, is it strong or a weak goal? If you like it, or if you want to tweak it, just take a minute and chat with your neighbor. Here's what I want you to do now. At the end of each row, I gave the people at the ends a checklist. I want you to use this checklist with your partner or by yourself. They're going to pass these down. So if you have one at the end of the row, you can take and pass them down. I want you to use this checklist and evaluate your goal. I think the newest part, if we're looking at this, is I want to unpack a few terms. I think thinking about goals and activities is helpful. Remember, a goal is going to be a broad statement describing what you plan to accomplish. Okay, what you plan to accomplish, and that is going to be time bound. You're going to bind that to this academic year. Okay, an activity is one of the specific steps you must take to meet your goal or objective. And in my opinion, and this is my opinion only, activities enter the goal writing when I need something to start to be measurable. Okay, and I have a feeling the measurable part is the part that's new for a lot of people. Okay, you've either been doing goals that you write or yes, no goals, I did it or I didn't do it, which is that's still a way to go, writing goals. Okay, we're just broadening our focus a little bit about that. If I'm thinking about the goal, it's the destination. It's where I'm going. If I'm thinking about the activity, it's the car I'm driving or the mode of transportation I'm using to get there, the stops I'm going to make along the way, where I'm going to eat. It's the stuff. Okay? So another way to look at this, goals are the why and the what, the outcomes you want to achieve this year. Activities are the how, those very specific steps you're going to take to achieve your goal. In my mind, and I said this, goals shape the activities you choose as they help you achieve your goal. So the activities in my mind are the steps along the way. So if my goal is to increase critical thinking, that is so broad that I'm going to need to conceptualize that and put some actionable steps in there to make that a faculty goal. Because it's my understanding the expectation is that these are measurable. These need to be measurable. And I think that's where a lot, including myself, because that has not been the expectation. I did that when I was a public school teacher. That was the expectation. But moving into higher ed, my goals have been more formulated along the lines of one of my teaching goals this year was to give feedback to students on their assignments in a more timely manner. I either did that or I didn't do that, but that's a little fuzzy and not measurable. And when I'm thinking about that, if one of my students gave me that on a lesson plan, they would get marked down because they haven't told me their measure of success. Okay, they haven't told me how you're going to know that. The question I always ask them is, how are you going to know if you were successful? What is it? I tell them all the time, I'm going to walk up to a student at the end of class and say, what did your teacher teach you today? And if they can't give me something that makes sense within your broad, right, how are you going to know whether or not you need to reteach this or redo this or work on this goal tomorrow? Things like that. I think if you're looking at the checklist, the new thing is measurable. I think the fourth bullet, is this aligned with professional goals, department goals, college goals, university goals, strategic plan? That it can just be a personal goal for your classroom, but I think the more you can cast vision and the more you can connect things to departmental goals, to strategic plans, to things like that, the more likely you are to get high support. Okay, that's just kind of the nature of the beast, I'm thinking. I would really pay attention here to your T&P guidelines of your department, especially if you're tenure track. Your goals should be documenting your progress towards that. So look at them. They're an action step towards that big portfolio you're going to write and the reflection you're going to do about your experience. Again, if I were starting with my faculty, all of our syllabi have at the very top that university mission, college mission, department mission. That's probably where I would start. Okay? Very big picture. My department as an exercise went through and we spent a year deciding what our picture of an ACU teacher education graduate should look like. And we got it down to 4 characteristics, and that's the conceptual framework of our program. And so our next goal was to revise all the SLOs and all our syllabi, but they all had to align to that. And then each activity in the course needs to align to the SLO. So I'm starting really big, and then I'm getting narrower and narrower as I go down. I would also look at, and I didn't do this because I was traveling home from Houston yesterday and working on this. I would look at the handbook, and because the rubrics are included in the handbook that Susan sent out yesterday, that the chairs are going to use to evaluate you. And that's just being smart. We tell our students all the time, if you want to know how I'm going to grade this assignment and you want to do well on it, you need to read the rubric. So I would look at the rubric. That the last bullet, does this goal involve or require other people? That doesn't mean you can't have a goal with other people, but make sure they're the right people and make sure they're dependable. And for example, I think this one comes up a lot in scholarship. I advise my new faculty. I had a brand new faculty member last year who was saying she was going to get an article published. No, that's relying on the editors. I'm going to submit an article. That's dependent on me. And so I want to be really careful there, and that I have control over the things I need to have control over in my world. I think one message that I did get loud and clear from the provost office is that it needs to be clear and specific. It needs to be something that a broader audience member could read and understand. Okay? And the way I have to think about that, everything I'm telling you today is coming through the lens of the School of Education or teacher education. It's also very strongly coming to you through a qualitative lens, because that's just who I am as a researcher, and that's what I do. But I need to make sure my goals, even if my goals are, and you'll see my goals in just a minute, are qualitative and teacher education focused. I need to write them in a way that if the dean or the provost or someone who's less familiar with my field than I am wanted to pull them up, they would make sense. Okay? Any questions so far? Yes?
Okay, so I'm trying to think about the delineation between an activity and a goal. Let's say I have a goal of increasing, the university has a strategic goal of student belonging, increasing student belonging. But that's a
very immeasurable thing.
But hosting students in my home is very specific.
It is very specific.
Activity, so.
I'm going to show you a couple of slides in a minute. I tended to put both of mine together. I tended to write the overarching goal first. I want to increase the student-faculty relationships on ACU. To that end, this year I will host blank number of times, blank. I mean, just make it measure. Does that make? That would be one goal. And my understanding, and I did look at the handbook for this one yesterday, is 3 to 5 goals total. That's across. Okay, because that's what the research says is doable and measurable. Okay, I think a little bit bigger. No, total. I think the number was much bigger at the beginning, and Rachel and I had some conversations and got that the research is very clear. 3 to 5 is all you're going to do and achieve. We've got to make this maintainable, okay? I also have some clarification on the stretch goals here in just a minute, because they're meant to be like your wildest dreams, like your big, hairy, scary goal. But they're not used to judge or evaluate you for your. One caveat to the 3 to 5, so you've got to have teaching, service, and scholarship or professional development if you're college faculty. The additional one would be for chairs. There will be a administrative goal. But you could still do one for each, okay? And really, Rachel looked at the background of the field, because this is her field of study, and I went back and looked at all my faculty, because this has been a consistent process in our field, in our college, in our department. And so 3 to 5 is pretty normally where my people write their goals. So 3 to 5 total. I know you heard much bigger numbers. No. And I did look in the handbook, and that is stated clearly. Okay, here we go. Okay, activities help you achieve your goal. And in fact, in my mind, I almost think you have to write an activity in there for it to be measurable. Okay? That's the way I train my teachers. And that was the biggest thing for me last night, was trying to not think like a teacher and to more think, because I would call what we're writing objectives. We would call them less of objectives over in my little world. We would say your overarching goal, and that's what I put. My overarching goal is to increase course rigor. Okay? That's my big picture. But now I've got to try to bring that down into something that's measurable for me, for my students, for my dean, so that I can communicate and so that I can improve my practice. So the bigger activity would be to update course readings and refine activities and increase the depth of knowledge. This is still not fully refined. This is still just brainstorming.
Because that's not measurable.
No, I've got measurable ones on the next slide. I promise I'm going to show you measurable ones. I promise. Okay, I know. You're just getting a peek inside my head, because I can't start with a specific activity. I am very much a backwards design person when it comes to curriculum, which means I start with the end in mind. Backwards design means the question I gave you, what is the picture of an ACU graduate of the College of the School of Education? That is the end in mind. We had to conceptualize and operationalize that, and then we worked backwards into all of our course syllabi and did SLOs and did objectives and did activities, and lots of faculty got rid of activities because we realized, well, this activity's been done for 100 years, but you know what? It's not serving those goals. Math kit. If any of you went through teacher education, we had to do a math kit with Lucy Hatch, and it was still going 5 years ago. Making all these manipulatives and making all, that is not, it was in service of, but by doing backwards design and by leading my faculty through that, they came to me and said, these don't match. I think I should not do this anymore. And that's the place I want to be in as a chair, right? I don't want to have to tell them, does this align? Okay, so I'm going to skip to the next one. I'll come back to this one, but here's what you're all, well, actually, I'm skipping 2 down. Let's look at a framework really, really quickly, and then I'll show you my measurable goals. Okay, this is just one framework out there, and if you Google and look at SMART goals, it'll come up. On the last slide, I've also linked a pretty helpful document that our candidates use. But a SMART goal, if the acronym helps, is specific, measurable, it's attainable, it's relevant, and it's time-bound. Yours is going to be naturally time-bound by the year, okay? So if I'm looking at writing SMART goals, some of the questions I'm asking myself would be like, specific is what am I going to do? Why is this important to me? Measurable, and again, I think measurable is going to be the tricky one for most people. I think that's the part that people might struggle with. And this would be the same. I ask these questions of my candidates. I ask these questions of myself at the end of a class. How will I know I've been successful? How will I know the goal has been reached? Attainable, what will I do, and is it attainable? I do think it's very important that we emphasize to all faculty that these need to be realistic goals. And that's why I'm glad that the number decreased. Because any more than that, and you're either going to write goals that aren't really goals, they're just things you're already doing, so you can check it off, or you're not going to meet your goals, and then you're going to be really hard on yourself, and right? Relevant, is it worthwhile? How does it achieve? How does it help students? How does it help me? How does it help the university? How does it help my program? How does it help my content field? There's a million how does it that you could put in there. And that's going to have to be very specific to you. I would also say relevant to me is, does it fit with my values? And now we're back to the struggle with TEA. Right? They're asking me to do things that are against my integrity as a teacher. So, but I have to play in that framework. And so the tricky thing is, how do I make it relevant to me and meaningful? Time bound, that you're going to do this year. I think when you're looking at SMART goals, and there are millions there's YouTube presentations on this. I've got a handout link. I think this can, and I'm fixing to show you 2 of my SMART goals for next year so that we can unpack it a little bit. I think this maybe puts it in a place where it makes a little more sense. It's also helpful when you write a SMART goal like this to think about potential obstacles, what could stand in your way. I'm going to go ahead and say for all of you a potential obstacle that we all probably put down at the bottom of our faculty evaluation is time. Does everyone put that every year? So it's also helpful in conversations with your chair because the goal would be that you're either having, I have a face-to-face conversation with my faculty about their goals, and questions I might ask would be, how can I help you achieve this goal? What resources do you need? What tools do you need? If they're new faculty or are they tenure track, how can I help you with publication? Or let's be real honest, Andrew does that. I send them to Andrew for mentoring, for scholarship, because come on. And so I'm thinking about tools and resources that I can provide from my office. That also helps me know what I need to ask my dean for when I, as chair, go to my monthly meetings. And then she's taking the same sort of list to the provost office. So again, the overwhelming idea here is for you to get some support in the things that you're doing. But if they're unknown and unspoken, it's really hard for the people in your corner to be in your corner, okay? I'm going to show you a couple of mine. I looked at the ones in the handout last night, in the booklet that she sent you. They don't make sense in my head because they're not me. And I think that's a really important thing to remember when you're writing goals. It's the same thing I tell my teachers when they're teaching. Taking someone else's goal and trying to make it yours is going to be about as effective as taking someone else's lesson plan and trying to teach it like they do. It doesn't work. Okay? So when I finally figured out last night, you're never going to be able to use those because they're not you, I just thought to myself, okay, I'm fixing to have to write these 2. And full disclosure, I've never written them by June 1st. This will be the first year ever I've done that by. So my first year's chair, I think I wrote them 2 days before my summative. It's exactly right. So I just thought, okay, teaching-wise, I just thought like a researcher. That's the easiest way to put this. What's a problem I'm having? And how do I want to address that? That's it. That's all I asked. So I came up with 2 things for teaching, okay? And we'll look at service and scholarship next, but I started with teaching because that's where I'm best. My first one, my overarching goal is I talked to you a little bit about this children's literature class, which is a 250 course, but they can take it prior to admission to the School of Education. And with the number of hours our students have now coming in, lots of them are first semester freshmen, okay? And I find myself in this position where everything I cover in the course, they're supposed to have learned by elementary school. Genre, 5 elements all narrative stories have, what's the difference between expository and fiction, plot diagrams, but they've either forgotten or they weren't taught it. And so I'm teaching it, and I'm really happy with the way I'm teaching it, but I'm afraid I'm sending the signal, and we make these notebooks, and I do it exactly like I would do it with my elementary kids, which means there's anchor charts and foldables, and I'm reading stories, and I don't want to send the message that there's not depth and critical thought that goes into the decisions I'm making, because they're so young, and because they haven't developed yet as teachers, and because good teachers make it look easy. They sit there and think, this is so fun. I hate that word. I hate it. I actually tell my next reading class, my 300 level reading class, if someone asks you as an administrator, why do you read aloud? And you say, it's because you're fun, it's because it's so fun, you're killing teachers as professionals. Well, actually, I read a quote from them, and the researcher says you sound like a Smurf. That is perfect, and it is true. It is engaging, and here's all the research-based practices I can show you that help students when they hear a fluent model read a good book. That's why we do it. Okay, there's my stuff. So, anyway, sorry. I really like my teaching soapbox. So I was thinking, how do I do that? Okay, I want to increase students' awareness of current educational topics and debates. This is children's literature. One of my goals last year was to focus a little bit more on book banning, and I do that specifically when we look at I pull diverse books all year, but I do pull out and make a unit of diverse books so they can look at some of the information about how hard they are to find, how underrepresented some populations of people are, all of those things. So I did that this year, and we had that wonderful article in the Texas Tribune by the Cooper High School teacher. We used that, but I'm wanting to do a little more. So I put, to increase students' awareness of current educational topics of debate, I will create, this is an activity, but I've embedded it in the larger goal. Does that make sense? I will create one new assignment, description and rubric, pertaining to the current culture of book banning in Texas to be implemented in the spring of 2027. I'm in study abroad in the fall, so I put spring. Okay? Now, I wrote that this morning, and I went into Rachel and said, this isn't measurable. And that's where I had to work on it, okay? Because this is a new way of thinking for me about what to put in a faculty goal. Students and faculty will debrief via a class discussion to informally assess the assignment and make improvements in following semesters. That's qualitative, but I can measure whether or not I did it. And when I go to my chair, I can have a conversation about the feedback I received, the revisions I might make, and what that means moving forward, okay? When you look at the goals in the handbook that was sent, they're a lot more measurable and they have percentages, and that's fine too. If your brain works like that, go with you. I can't. Okay, here's my second one. Another problem I'm having in a junior level foundations of reading course where we're really hitting theory hard and best practices. And basically I'm teaching them that the way we teach reading in schools is awful and shouldn't be done, and we need to do something counterproductive or counterintuitive. Not counterproductive, it's productive. Sorry. That's what we have now. We have counterproductive. They have to video themselves teaching a lesson on the carpet with a real children's book, but focusing on metacognition and comprehension strategies, okay? I have noticed, I don't know if you have the same experience in the last 10 or 12 years, the quality of my student products is decreasing. Okay? Students aren't coming in like they used to. Now, I can bemoan that and say that, and we all know that there's an element of truth to that. The critical thinking, the grit, that we can all look at the research, we know that, right? But I get paid to teach the students who show up. So I'm going to look at what I need to do. That's what informed this next goal, okay? So my second teaching goal, and I'm going to be real honest, I usually have 2 teaching and 1 scholarship and 1 service, and that's it, okay? Because I'm leaning into what I'm strong at. There actually now probably might be 2 service because I'm serving as chair, but before there was just 1 service, 1 scholarship. If I'm leaning into this next one, my big picture goal is Clarity of Assignments and Read 363. It's called Foundations of Reading and an improved student product. I want better mini lessons. And the way I've been teaching it is not enough for the current students I have. That's what led me to write this goal. Working with another member of the literacy team. So that a peer reviewer is what that would be. Mine would probably be Dr. Huddleston. I will refine and revise the assignment guidelines and rubric for the mini lesson assignment to better scaffold the experience for student learning. I know, I'm very wordy. You don't have to have near this many words in your goal. Scaffolds will include an article. I've identified an article that they can read that makes the process of doing a think aloud really clear, and a reading guide. The reading guide is my way to help them hone in the article on what I think is most important. My reading guides usually have a before reading prompt, a during reading activity, something to keep them engaged in the text, and then an after reading reflection. A reading guide, individual student conferences, and the opportunity for feedback from the instructor prior to submission. This will be implemented in the spring of 2027. Effectiveness will be determined comparing past assessments with the spring 2027 assessment. Okay? Again, these are highly specific to me and very, very wordy, but I did really have to put together the goal and the activity to make it work in my mind and to make it be measurable. Okay? There are lots of examples in the handbook that was sent to you from the provost office yesterday, and along with that there are templates. So like I would call them a sentence stem as an elementary teacher. It's got some missing holes, but you could fill in the holes and it would make a measurable goal. I think the most helpful thing on there is what a goal is not, some broad statements. So it is not, if we're thinking about scholarship, Dr. Huddleston and I have concluded a 2-year study based on Sea Grant funds talking about teacher and literacy adaptability. Okay, I this year wrote continue my research with Dr. Huddleston. It's not measurable. It's just not specific enough. So the way I would amend that for next year is we've concluded our study. Next year, we will continue to code data from and make significant progress towards, right? I can just change that language a little bit and put a little more clarity in there so that whoever's reading it can know exactly where I am in the research process and what I'm doing moving forward. And that's the only scholarship goal I'll have next year.
What if you're, this is a good example of like, what if you have a new prep? Like, what do you choose from that? Just choose a particular module, or like, what are your...
What I advise my new faculty members to do, because they're usually inheriting a module, I usually, our goal would be broader. Our goal would be critically examine the content of whatever course number is for successful implementation in the fall. Successful is my measure there. I'm being a little more vague than some of the goals, but I think you almost have to be. And then what I tell my new faculty is to look at one particular thing. Your only goal this semester is to look at the module and make it your own. And so now we're going to have to sit down and work on writing that as a measurable goal, whether that means they identify a new textbook, or they identify a new reading, or they bring a guest speaker in, or they modify the PowerPoints, so I would have to talk specifically with that faculty member and say, you've looked at the module now, you've looked at the course, it's going to be a new prep for you, or you're going to redesign. If you're redesigning a course, tell me what you're redesigning. And I would say, don't bite off the whole elephant, take one bite. And what could you do? So I would talk with a faculty member. Most of the time, faculty members really don't like I had a brand new math faculty member this year, and she inherited PowerPoints that were like 75 to 80 slides long. Why? And so her goal was to critically examine the new course and make it her own. And specifically, her goal was to edit and revise PowerPoint presentations so that she could use them in the classroom. And you could set a number on that. If there were 15 modules, because there's 15 weeks, you could say, I think a reasonable goal would be to do 3 to 5 of those this year. 3 to 5 is all so if I wanted to put a number in there, I could say and modify, this is me kind of gaming the system, I would qualify and say a minimum of 3. So you can always outperform your goal. Your goal is the baseline. Does that make sense? So that's how I would do that, yes.
So looking down the road, there are people that are going through tenure promotion. Is this having 3 to 5 goal, is that going to be sufficient to up? Because I feel like you might not, in fact, be success. You're going to have a lot of things we do outside of that, but that's what we would go back to. So
I have a folder on my computer where I dropped everything from my portfolio and kept an ongoing journal of reflections. So looking at my portfolio for full tenure was very different than looking at my faculty inside because it tells the story. I don't know if that's the correct answer. Is that what? To say other, there's an area that says other things done, not in goals, and I just make sure to put a really good list there when I was going up, and I make sure to keep track of that.
If you want your chair to know.
Right, if you want your chair to know. So that's what my faculty lists it under the other, and it does 2 things. It helps me know, and it helps them know so that when they are writing their portfolio, they can go back and look at it. But personally, I had a folder on my computer where I'm dropping things as they come in, and it just labeled tenure, and it's just, so I didn't have to, the first time I went up, I had to gather everything brand new because I hadn't been doing it and didn't even have a current CV, and I'm a slow learner, but I did learn. So, but I would definitely note that in other, and it is not uncommon for me to note in the other as chair and remind my faculty members, but you also did this, and you also did this, because I feel like that's part of my responsibility to kind of help them narrow that down. Does that make sense? I mean, they can, and 3 to 5 is the minimum. Again, if you want to write 3 for each one, my challenge with that is the research is pretty clear that 3 to 5 is all you're going to actually achieve. And then one of 2 things happens. You're either overwhelmed and you don't achieve them, or you write goals that aren't really goals because they were things you were doing anyway. For example, in my department, nobody could write a goal that they were going to align their syllabus to the Texas teacher education standards, because that's the expectation. You have to do that, right? Legally, TEA has to see that in your syllabus or we get in trouble. So that's a bottom level, that's not really a goal. A goal is stretching me a little bit, which is, we need to talk about stretch goals for just one little second. Stretch goals, and I pulled this is language right out of the handbook Susan sent yesterday. A stretch goal is goals that are intentionally ambitious and are designed to encourage innovation, growth, meaningful progress, or exceptional impact beyond the standard expectations. Faculty are encouraged to pursue significant goals without concern that thoughtful, ambitious, or reasonable risk-taking will be penalized in the evaluation process. Stretch goals only count in favor of faculty members in the calculation for merit raise eligibility. So if you have a stretch goal and you're working towards that, and that counts favorably, but it would not be counted against you, you're not expected to meet stretch goals. So when I was talking to, I have 2 examples, one from my department and one from Laura Carroll. When I was talking to Laura Carroll about her stretch goals, so her direct report is the provost, I think? Okay, so she directs reports to the provost, so that's who looks at her goals when she had her meeting. And one of her stretch goals for several years now had been to implement a faculty renewal retreat in Leipzig. That was a dream, but because she wrote it down and it was a goal and then it was on Susan's radar, they made progress towards that, and they've been able to do that 2 times now, okay? Someone in my department last year, after going on the faculty renewal and spending some time in conversation with Mark Bernesh and with Melissa Long and talking about the kinesiology trip that went to Switzerland and looked at the Olympic facilities and Olympic athletes and did things like that, Mark was really sharing with one of my faculty members about his desire to have these short-term study abroad sites where we were looking at the best of the best. Who's doing this the best in our field? I had a faculty member who wrote this as a goal. I would now qualify it as a stretch goal to explore the possibility of a study abroad education trip to Finland, because that's the best school system in the world. So, and it was very intriguing to him to think about what would it look like if we could take, we know what they're saying, but what would it look like if we could take them to this? How could that change things? That's a stretch goal That's not something that's immediately achievable. That's likely not something. But if I write it down, again, what I write down and give priority to is on my radar. And then it's on my chair's radar and leadership's radar and on down. So that would be the stretch goal. So you need to have a minimum of 1 per teaching, scholarship, service. And then I would think about, do you have this out there dream, right? Do you have this out there stretch goal or something that you would like to do?
Would you identify it as a stretch goal?
Yes, and in the handbook, there's it's explicit instructions to put an asterisk beside it. And I am such a kindergarten teacher, I would also write stretch goal in parentheses at the end. I mean, I want it to be crystal clear. Like it might be in a different color and italicized and all this stuff. But in the handbook that Susan put out, it said to put an asterisk by it and to clearly identify that as your stretch goal. The only other thing I really had was I would hope that you could apply this, go through this same sort of thought process. I gave you an example of a scholarship goal. So my scholarship goal for next year will be to continue data analysis and coding of the data collected from, and I'll name the study, and make significant progress towards completing that by the end of blank. I'm going to put significant progress because I can't put exactly how many interviews and stuff we'll get through. But so I was thinking about a service goal. Service goals to me are probably the ones that are going to be the most yes or no measured leaning. And if you look at the language Susan put in the handbook, I think she acknowledges that. So like my service goals, I will increase my participation in state advocacy for public education by serving as the incoming president of the TACTI organization, which is, I don't know. It's all the deans and chairs. It's all the legal authorities of all the programs in Texas. We meet together so that we can try to advocate together and have one voice, all public and private. So there's about a group of 65 of us, and that's my goal. That is really just a yes or no one. I either serve as the president or I don't. Now, in your reflection, when you're reflecting on it, for example, I might reflect on I'll be in charge of next summer's TACTI conference, and I might reflect on, I feel like I did this because I invited these speakers, or I feel like I did this because I went to an SBEC meeting, or State Board of Education.